Hey friends, we are looking at Amos chapter 7 today, and just like Leah said in her video yesterday, if you're a little bit confused reading this passage, join the club. The heading in the NIV for this chapter is Locusts, Fire, and a Plumb Line. So very mysterious, but when I read that heading, I was like, I'm excited to get into this chapter. It's going to be a weird one. And it is a little bit. So basically what's happening here is that God is telling Amos about some ways that he might bring judgment on his own people. If you remember, God's people are walking in sin and wickedness and corruption, and God's justice requires him to punish sin. And each time that God shares a way that he's going to do this, Amos responds and is just pleading for God's mercy. He's pleading for God not to bring judgment. And he knows that God's people deserve judgment for their sin, but he also knows that God could utterly destroy his own people if he wanted to. But it's a little sobering because God kind of closes by saying, I'm doing this. My justice and righteousness will prevail. And that's the first half of the chapter. And then the second half shifts to this conversation between Amos and these two guys. And one of them is the king of Israel, and his name is Jeroboam. And the other guy is the priest of Israel, and his name is Amaziah. So Amos is talking to these two guys, and he calls them out for their sin, which is what God told him to do. And these two guys respond pretty much by telling Amos to get the you-know-what out of town. And so that kind of brings us to our discussion question today, the one that I want to talk about. And it goes like this. How do you and I respond when someone calls us out for our sin? And I think if you're anything like me, it's usually not very well. And I don't know about you, but this whole staying at home business is just not really helping me to walk in love with the people around me. And it's actually making me more irritable and sometimes downright miserable just being stuck at home. And my Sarah called me out on this the other day, and that kind of made me even more frustrated, to be honest. And thankfully, I did not tell her to get the you-know-what out of our house, which is good, but I was frustrated. And I think, after having some time to think about it, I realized she's right. And so I'm asking Sarah and I'm asking God for their grace, but I'm asking them to call me out when I am irritated and miserable so that I can have the opportunity to confess. And by God's grace and by his Spirit to help me to bring gentleness into my home, especially during this time. So what about you? How are you doing? Has this time at home brought out any sin in your life? And what would it look like to confess that sin to God and maybe to your family, to friends? I trust that God, he's good, and he stands ready to forgive us when we confess. And I'm sure your family and friends would as well. So that's what I got for us today. Love you guys. Talk soon.